September 19th, 1944. A wall of fog sits over the rolling fields of Lorraine, France, so thick you can barely see 50 yards in any direction. Captain Kenneth Lamison of Charlie Company, 37th Tank Battalion, is standing in the turret of his Sherman tank near the village of Leasy, peering into a white void. His crew has been warned. German Panthers are somewhere out there. The Panther, 45 tons of sloped armor and a gun that can kill a Sherman from over a mile away. Lamison's men know this. Every American tanker in France knows this. They have watched friends burn alive inside Shermans because their shells bounced off the Panther's hide like pebbles off a brick wall. But today, tucked into Lamison's ammunition rack, are 6 rounds that look different from the rest. Lighter, sleeker. Each one contains a core of tungsten carbide, one of the hardest substances on the planet, wrapped in a lightweight aluminum body. 6 rounds. That is all they were given. 6 chances to rewrite everything they thought they knew about fighting Panthers. And then it happens. A shape emerges from the fog, 75 meters away, close enough to see the iron cross on the turret. A Panther. Factory new. Its long barrel is swinging toward them. Lamison's gunner does not hesitate. He fires. The round leaves the barrel at over 1,000 meters per second. It crosses the distance in a fraction of a heartbeat. The tungsten core slams into the Panther's gun mantlet. It does not bounce. It does not shatter. It punches clean through. A fraction of a second later, the Panther's ammunition detonates. The turret lifts. Flame erupts from every hatch. 45 tons of German engineering becomes a funeral pyre. 2 more Panthers lunge from the mist. Both are destroyed within seconds. The surviving German tanks do something American tankers have never seen before. They turn and run. Panthers, running from Shermans. For the first time since D-Day, the rules of armored warfare have changed. And the Germans never saw it coming. But here is the question nobody asks. How did 6 tiny rounds, in a war consuming millions of shells a day, turn the most feared tank in Europe into a target? How did a handful of tungsten cores, scraped together from mines in China, Colorado, and Nevada, break an illusion of invincibility that had paralyzed American tank crews for months? And why, if these rounds were so effective, did each Sherman only get 6 of them? To understand how 6 rounds terrified the Panther crews at Aracourt, we need to go back to the beaches of Normandy, to a disaster that American generals refused to believe was coming, and to a lie, a comfortable, dangerous lie, that would cost hundreds of young men their lives before anyone admitted the truth. Part 1. The Lie That Killed. Let me take you back to the spring of 1944. The greatest invasion in human history is being planned. Allied commanders are drawing up the blueprint for D-Day. They are thinking about beaches, about paratroopers, about naval bombardments. What they are not thinking about, what they should have been losing sleep over, is what happens when their tanks meet the Panther. Here is the dirty little secret of the Allied command structure in 1944. They knew the Panther existed. They had intelligence reports. They had captured examples, and they chose to believe it would not be a problem. The M4 Sherman was the backbone of the American armored force. Picture it. 30 tons, a 75mm gun, reliable engine, easy to manufacture. American factories had been pouring these things out like candy. By war's end, they would produce approximately 49,324 Shermans. That is not a typo. 49,000 tanks. The arsenal of democracy was not a slogan. It was an assembly line running 3 shifts, 7 days a week. But the Sherman had a problem. Its gun could not kill a Panther from the front. Let me say that again, because it matters. The 75mm M3 gun that armed most Shermans in Normandy could not penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at any range. 0. Not at 1,000 yards. Not at 500 yards. Not if you drove up and pressed the barrel against the glacis plate. The round would simply bounce off. Why? Because the Panther's designers had done something brilliant. They angled the frontal plate at 55 degrees, 80 millimeters of steel, sloped, creating an effective thickness of roughly 140 millimeters. It was like trying to punch through a bank vault with your fist. The physics simply did not work. Now picture this from the perspective of a 20-year-old Sherman gunner sitting in Normandy in July 1944. You are looking through your gun sight at a Panther 800 yards away. You know, you have been told by veterans, by intelligence officers, by the craters in the armor of burned-out Shermans along the roadside, that your shell will not penetrate. But the Panther's gun, its high-velocity 75mm KWK-42 can punch through your armor from over 2,000 meters away. 2,000 meters. That is more than a mile. Think about what that means for a moment. The Panther can kill you from a distance at which you cannot even hurt it. You are in a gunfight where your pistol shoots blanks, and the other guy has a rifle. Imagine climbing into that tank every morning. Imagine the sound of your heartbeat in your ears as you roll down a hedgerow-lined lane in Normandy, knowing that a Panther could be behind any wall, in any orchard, waiting, and when it fires, your only options are to reverse frantically, call for artillery, or die. Crews started giving the Sherman a nickname. They called it the Ronson, like the cigarette lighter. Lights every time. Now, post-war analysis would show this reputation was somewhat exaggerated. Wet ammunition stowage and other improvements reduced the fire risk. But in the summer of 1944, nobody cared about post-war analysis. They cared about the fireball they watched consume their buddy's tank yesterday. The numbers tell a story that no amount of retrospective analysis can soften. The 3rd Armored Division entered Normandy with 232 M4 Sherman tanks. Over the course of the European campaign, it had 648 Shermans completely destroyed in combat, and another 700 knocked out, repaired, and put back into operation. That is a loss rate of 580%. They went through nearly 6 full sets of tanks. Think about that. Every Sherman in the division was destroyed and replaced, on average, almost 6 times over. Behind every one of those destroyed tanks was a crew of 5 men. Some survived, many did not. Lieutenant Colonel William B. Lovelady of the 3rd Armored Division told a story that became infamous among American tankers. One of his Shermans turned a corner and came face to face with a Panther at close range. The Sherman got off 3 shots, 3 well-aimed rounds at the front of a Panther. All 3 bounced off. The Panther fired once. The Sherman brewed up 3 shots, 3 bounces, 1 dead crew. That is the equation that was driving American tankers toward despair in the summer of 1944. Here is where the institutional failure begins. Remember those numbers I gave you about Sherman production? 49,000. Well, the Germans produced approximately 6,000 Panthers during the entire war. That is roughly an 8-to-1 ratio in favor of the Americans. American generals looked at that ratio and thought, good enough, we will overwhelm them with numbers. But the numbers only tell part of the story. By June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, approximately 38% of German tanks in the theater were Panthers. That was not the handful that American intelligence had predicted. That was hundreds of these advanced medium tanks waiting in the hedgerows and villages of northern France. And while many Panther crews were inexperienced, the tanks themselves did not care about crew experience. 80 millimeters of sloped steel stops a 75mm shell, regardless of who is sitting inside. The German factories had been ramping Panther production aggressively. In 1944 alone, they produced approximately 3,900 Panthers, more than in any other year. The tank was supposed to become the standard medium tank of every German panzer division, gradually replacing the Panzer IV. The Americans had anticipated fighting mostly Panzer IVs and assault guns. What they got was a wall of sloped armor. But here is what they missed. Ratios mean nothing if your crews refuse to engage. And by mid-July 1944, something very dangerous was happening in American armored units across Normandy. Tank commanders who spotted Panthers were choosing to stop, call for air support or artillery, and wait. They were ceding the initiative to the enemy. Not because they were cowards, because they were rational. Why drive into a bullet you know cannot hurt the enemy? On July 2nd, 1944, the complaints reached the very top. Reports about the 75mm gun's inability to deal with German armor landed on the desk of General Dwight Eisenhower himself. His reaction, documented by witnesses, was explosive. He could not believe what he was hearing. "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out?" he demanded. "Why, I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war." The full quote, as recorded by those present, continued with even stronger language. Eisenhower was furious that Ordnance had assured him the 76mm would take care of anything the Germans had. Think about the gravity of that moment. The supreme Allied commander in Europe, 4 weeks into the largest amphibious invasion in history, with hundreds of thousands of troops committed to the fight, is being told that his primary fighting vehicle cannot kill the enemy's primary fighting vehicle. This is not a minor equipment complaint. This is a fundamental threat to the campaign. The British had solved their version of this problem with the Sherman Firefly, a Sherman mounting a 17-pounder gun that could actually penetrate Panthers and Tigers at reasonable ranges. But Firefly production was limited, and the Americans had not adopted the design. By the end of June, there were only 84 Fireflies in Normandy. By month's end, 149. A handful of effective tank killers in an ocean of Shermans that could not do the job. The truth was worse than Eisenhower imagined. The 76mm M1 gun, the improved weapon that was supposed to be the answer, was itself inadequate. Using standard M62 armor-piercing capped ammunition, the 76mm could penetrate about 109mm of armor at 1,000 meters. Against a Panzer IV? Plenty. Against a Panther's sloped frontal plate? Not even close. The 76 could penetrate the Panther's gun mantlet, that curved section of armor around the cannon, but only at extremely close range, typically under 100 meters. 100 meters from a Panther. Let that sink in. That is across a football field. At that distance, the Panther's crew can see the whites of your eyes, and they have a gun that can go through your tank like a hot knife through butter. A board convened on July 12, 1944, made it official. Standard American tank weapons could not reliably defeat the Panther from the front. And here is what the statistics do not capture: the human cost of institutional overconfidence. By the end of July 1944, American armored units in Normandy had suffered devastating losses. Not because their crews lacked courage, not because their tactics were poor, but because they had been sent to fight a war with the wrong weapon. Imagine being a replacement crew arriving at a tank battalion in Normandy. Your first day, you are assigned to a Sherman that still has scorch marks inside the turret from the crew that burned to death in it last Tuesday. The maintenance guys have scraped out what they could and patched the holes. Your platoon sergeant hands you a piece of advice that no training manual ever contained. If you see a Panther, do not engage. Call for air, call for artillery, but do not try to fight it head-on. You will lose. That is the doctrine of despair, and it was spreading through the American armored force like a disease. Here is the kicker. The improved 76mm Shermans had been available since January 1944. 130 M4A 176mm tanks arrived in Britain on April 10th, 2 months before D-Day. They were sitting in depots, ready to go, and the brass refused to deploy them on June 6th. Why? Multiple reasons, all of them bad. Crews had not trained enough on the new gun. Logistical officers worried about maintaining 2 different ammunition types. And most critically, American commanders believed the 75mm would be adequate. That word, adequate, should be etched on a tombstone somewhere. It was not until July 25th during Operation Cobra that 102 of these 76mm Shermans finally made their combat debut, and the early reports? Sobering. The 76 was better than the 75, certainly. Against Panzer IVs and assault guns, it was effective, but against Panther frontal armor, still bouncing. So there they were, the most powerful industrial nation on Earth, with tens of thousands of tanks, and they could not solve a problem that a German engineer had created with a protractor and an armor plate. But remember the name Kenneth Lamison. Remember those 6 rounds, because while Eisenhower was learning the bad news, and while tank crews were dying in the hedgerows, engineers in testing facilities back in the United States were working on something that would change everything. A round built around a mineral so rare, so strategically vital, that nations fought wars just to control its supply. tungsten, and the race to turn it into ammunition would become one of the most desperate and least known industrial battles of the entire war. But before we get to the solution, we need to understand just how deep the hole was, because the Panther problem was not just about armor thickness, it was about psychology, and the psychological damage was about to get much, much worse. Part 2. The Tungsten Gamble. To understand the weapon that would save American tankers, you first have to understand a rock. Not just any rock. Tungsten, the heaviest naturally occurring metal you have ever held, dense as gold, hard enough to scratch steel, and in 1944, rarer than a straight answer from a politician. Tungsten carbide, tungsten combined with carbon, is one of the hardest materials known to metallurgy. It sits just below diamond on the hardness scale. If you took a tungsten carbide ball and dropped it on a steel plate from waist height, the plate would dent. The ball would not scratch. That density and hardness is exactly what you need to punch through armor. The engineers at the U.S. Army Ordnance Department had known this since 1942. They had been testing what they called high-velocity armor-piercing projectiles, HVAP for short, since the spring of that year. The concept was elegant. Take a small, incredibly dense tungsten carbide core, wrap it in a lightweight aluminum body with a ballistic windshield, fire it from a standard 76mm tank gun. The lighter overall weight means higher muzzle velocity. The denser core means more energy concentrated on a smaller impact point. Instead of a heavy steel slug trying to bludgeon its way through armor, you get a tungsten dart moving at blistering speed, focusing all its kinetic energy into a point barely wider than a thumb. The result? The round that would be designated M93. Muzzle velocity, 1,036 meters per second. Compare that to the standard M62 round at 792 meters per second. That 244 meters per second difference does not sound like much until you understand what it means in terms of armor penetration. At 1,000 meters, the M93 HVAP could penetrate approximately 178 millimeters of armor. At that same range, the M62 managed about 109 millimeters. Remember the Panther's gun mantlet? That curved section of cast steel protecting the cannon? On early variants, it was around 100 millimeters thick. On later models, up to 120 millimeters. With the standard M62 round, you needed to be within 100 meters, point-blank range, to have any chance of getting through. With the M93 HVAP, you could reliably penetrate that mantlet at up to 1,000 meters, a tenfold increase in engagement range. Let me put that in human terms. Before HVAP, an American tanker had to drive close enough to a Panther to read the serial numbers on its road wheels before he could hurt it. After HVAP, he could kill it from across an open field. That is the difference between suicide and survival. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because having a wonder weapon means nothing if you cannot build it. Tungsten does not grow on trees. In 1944, the world's primary source was China, which produced approximately 36% of the global supply. Think about that for a moment. In the middle of a world war, with Japan controlling most of East Asia, the Allies were dependent on Chinese tungsten, transported overland through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, to make the ammunition they desperately needed in France. The United States had domestic tungsten deposits, Colorado, Nevada, California, but they were limited. Total American production, combined with Chinese imports, had to serve every war industry simultaneously. Machine tools needed tungsten. Armor plate hardening needed tungsten. Armor-piercing ammunition for multiple calibers, from rifle rounds to naval shells, needed tungsten. Every pound allocated to 76mm HVAP rounds was a pound taken from something else. Each M93 round contained approximately 0.88 kilograms of tungsten carbide. That is just under 2 pounds. A single Sherman carrying 6 rounds consumed nearly 5 kilograms of this precious material. Now multiply that by thousands of Shermans. You start to see the problem. Production began painfully slowly. In July 1944, the very month Eisenhower was learning his tanks could not kill Panthers, the the factories managed to produce about 1,000 rounds of 3-inch HVAP for tank destroyers. In August, the first 1,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP rolled off the line. September, another 1,000. Not until November did monthly production reach 5,000 rounds. By January 1945, output had crawled up to 7,000 per month. Let me give you the number that tells the whole story. By February 1945, the average 76mm Sherman in Europe had received a total of 5 HVAP rounds. 5 rounds. 5 chances to kill a Panther before you were back to ammunition that could not touch it. A typical Sherman company fielded 17 tanks, that is 85 HVAP rounds for an entire company, against a German formation that might deploy 30 or more Panthers. You do the math. Imagine being a supply officer trying to distribute these things. You have 5,000 rounds arriving at a depot in France. You have 60 tank battalions screaming for them. Tank destroyer units, whose primary job is killing enemy armor, get priority. Sherman crews, who encounter Panthers more often, but have a secondary role as infantry support, get whatever is left. Some battalions received a decent allotment. Others got almost nothing, and had to fight through the autumn of 1944 with standard ammunition, knowing that a better round existed somewhere in the pipeline. Now here is where I want to tell you about a man named Creighton Abrams. Remember that name. It is going to matter. In September 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams was 30 years old. He was born in Springfield, Massachusetts, the son of a railroad worker. He graduated from West Point in 1936, class rank 185 out of 276. Not exactly top of the class. His classmates included William Westmoreland, who would later command American forces in Vietnam, and Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who would lead the Tuskegee Airmen. But something about Abrams transcended grades on paper. George Patton, not a man given to praising subordinates, would later say of him, "I'm supposed to be the best tank commander in the Army, but I have one peer, Abe Abrams. He's the world champion." That is not a compliment. That is a coronation. From Patton, the man who believed he had been a Roman legionnaire in a past life. Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, led by Major General John S. Tiger Jack Wood, one of the most aggressive division commanders in the American Army. The 4th Armored had been activated in April 1941 and deployed to France in July 1944. By September, they were Patton's tip of the spear. The division's main fighting units were 3 brigade-sized combat commands, A, B, and Reserve, each organized around a single tank battalion of 53 Sherman medium tanks and 17 Stuart light tanks, plus an armored infantry battalion, artillery, and supporting units. The 37th Tank Battalion's motto, "Courage Conquers." Abrams led from the front, literally. He rode in the turret of his own Sherman, which he named Thunderbolt. He would go through 7 Thunderbolts by war's end. 7 tanks shot out from under him, or rather, not quite from under him. Remarkably, Abrams was never personally in a tank when it was knocked out. He seemed to have an instinct for when to dismount and direct from the ground. His gunner was Corporal John Gatuski. Gatuski knocked out the first German tank the battalion encountered after entering combat in Normandy. Nobody kept an exact count of Gatuski's kills, but everyone in the battalion agreed it was more than any other gunner in the unit. One fellow tanker recalled, "I can remember during our tank battles, Abe was shooting tanks like the rest of the boys. He would mix in wherever the toughest battle was. It made us feel like fighting harder when you could see a great man like Abe alongside of you." By September 1944, the 37th Tank Battalion was the spearhead of Patton's Third Army. They had broken out of Normandy. They had raced across France. They had crossed the Moselle River and seized a bridgehead near the town of Aricourt in Lorraine. And it was here, in the rolling farmland of eastern France, with autumn fog settling into the valleys, that the 37th Tank Battalion would face the most dangerous test of its existence. Because the Germans had noticed Patton's advance, and they were sending their newest, best-equipped armored units to stop it. Remember the Panther problem? The one we just spent 15 minutes talking about? It was about to arrive at Aricourt, in large numbers, with fresh crews and factory-new tanks. But so were 6 rounds per Sherman. The German plan was straightforward. General Hasso von Manteuffel, a promising panzer commander who would later lead the 5th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge, was given 2 newly formed panzer brigades, the 111th and the 113th. Together with elements of the 11th Panzer Division, this force assembled approximately 262 tanks and assault guns. Among them, 107 Panthers and 75 Panzer IVs, plus 80 self-propelled guns. Against this force, Abrams had roughly 50 Shermans in Combat Command A. On paper, this was not a battle. It was an execution. The Germans had more than a 5-to-1 numerical advantage. They had Panthers. They had fresh equipment. Their plan called for a swift counterattack to destroy the American bridgehead, recapture the town of Luneville, and push Patton back across the Moselle. But on paper is where German plans went to die on the Western Front, because those plans had a fatal flaw. Several fatal flaws, actually. The panzer brigades had been assembled in a rush. Their crews had weeks, not months, of training. Many had never fired their main guns at a moving target. The brigades lacked adequate reconnaissance units, the eyes and ears of any armored formation, and they lacked integrated infantry, artillery, and engineering support. In short, the Germans were sending a hammer with no handle. The 113th Panzer Brigade, commanded by Colonel Erich Freiherr von Seckendorf, entered the assembly area on September 18th. Seckendorf was about to lead 42 Panthers and roughly 40 Panzer IVs into battle. He would not survive the week. Meanwhile, the 111th Panzer Brigade was supposed to attack simultaneously from the south, creating a pincer. But on the night of September 18th, moving through the Perroy Forest in the dark, the 111th got lost. A patriotic French farmer gave them wrong directions. The entire brigade, Panthers, Panzer IVs, half-tracks, support vehicles, blundered through pitch-black forest roads, ending up miles from their intended staging area. They would arrive at the battle a full day late. Picture the German staff officers receiving this news. Their carefully planned 2-pronged attack has just lost 1 prong. The 113th must attack alone, without the southern hammer that was supposed to drive the Americans into the northern anvil. But orders from high command are clear. The attack must proceed. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, is under enormous pressure from OKH, the German Army High Command, to halt Patton's advance. Delay is not an option. Manteuffel understands that attacking with 1 brigade instead of 2 dramatically reduces his chances. But in September 1944, the German military does not have the luxury of waiting for perfect conditions. So on the morning of September 19th, the 113th attacked alone, into the fog, against Creighton Abrams and his 6 rounds per tank. Remember the moment at the beginning of this video? The Panther materializing from the mist, 75 meters from Lameson's Sherman? That was the opening act of what would become the largest tank engagement fought by American forces until the Battle of the Bulge. 11 days of combat that would shatter 2 German panzer brigades and fundamentally change the psychological balance of armored warfare. But the battle itself, the desperate fighting, the stunning reversals, the moment when the Germans realized everything they believed about American tanks was wrong, that is coming next. And if you think the first 3 Panthers were the most dramatic part, you have not heard about the man in the Piper Cub with 6 bazookas strapped to his wings. Part 3. The 11 days that broke the Panther myth. The morning of September 19th, 1944, begins in silence, or rather in fog. The kind of fog that turns the landscape into an abstract painting, fields vanishing into white, tree lines appearing and disappearing like ghosts. Visibility drops to less than 100 meters in some areas. For the Germans, this is a problem. The Panther's greatest advantage is its long-range gun. The KWK-42 can kill a Sherman from 2,000 meters. In fog, that advantage evaporates. You cannot hit what you cannot see. For the Americans, the fog is a gift from the weather gods. But nobody knows that yet. At CCA headquarters near Aracourt, Colonel Bruce Clark, the man commanding Combat Command A, is reviewing plans for an offensive push towards the Saar that was supposed to launch this very morning. Clark has no idea that 42 Panthers and dozens of other armored vehicles are rolling toward him through the mist. The first hint of trouble comes from the listening posts. Just before midnight on September 18th, American outposts near Lisi hear the unmistakable sound of tracked vehicles moving in the darkness. Heavy vehicles, tanks. They call in artillery fire, and the clanking stops. But the silence is deceptive. The 113th Panzer Brigade is not retreating. It is repositioning. At approximately 7:30 in the morning, a liaison officer named Captain William Dwight is driving his jeep between two command posts when he spots something through a gap in the mist. A column of German tanks, Panthers, moving west toward Aracourt. Dwight does not panic. He spins his jeep around, races back to Combat Command A headquarters, and reports what he has seen. Colonel Bruce Clark, commanding CCA, knows immediately how dangerous this is. German armor is approaching his headquarters. He has artillery, a battalion of M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, but no tanks immediately available. Clark does something remarkable. He orders his artillerymen to lower their howitzers to point-blank range and fire directly at the approaching German tanks. Picture that. Howitzers, weapons designed to arc shells over hills at targets miles away, being used like giant shotguns against Panthers at a few hundred yards. Dwight, meanwhile, grabs a platoon of tank destroyers from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion and races to intercept. Just west of Bézange-la-Petite, the 4 American tank destroyers spot German armor through the fog. They deploy in a shallow depression and open fire at about 150 yards. In the vicious firefight that follows, 3 of the 4 American tank destroyers are destroyed. But before they die, they take 7 German tanks with them. Captain Dwight survives. He would later receive recognition for the action. But that small engagement illustrates something crucial about Aracourt. American units, even outnumbered, even surprised, fought back ferociously. They did not run. Now remember Lamesson's Charlie Company positioned near Lisi. The first contact happens at that terrifying close range. 75 meters. 3 Panthers destroyed in seconds. But the morning is far from over. The 113th Panzer Brigade attacks in a series of company-sized jabs, probing for weaknesses in the American line. The problem is, they are probing blind. Without proper reconnaissance units, the German tank commanders cannot locate American positions until they are already under fire. And in the fog, under fire means being hit from a direction you cannot identify. The German tanks, factory new and crewed by green soldiers, make a critical, tactical error. They advance in column formation, one tank behind another, strung out along roads and farm tracks. This is what happens when you do not have scouts telling you where the enemy is. You bunch up on the roads because at least the roads are visible. Veteran American tankers exploit this mercilessly. A Sherman platoon can take a hull-down position behind a rise, let the lead Panther in a column pass an ambush point, and then engage from the flank. A Panther's side armor is only 40 to 50 millimeters thick. Even a standard 75 millimeter round can penetrate that. With HVAP, it goes through like the armor is not there. Throughout the morning, the pattern repeats. German armor advances blindly. American defenders, who know the terrain, who have been positioned by experienced officers like Abrams and Lamesson, wait until the fog gives them a shot at close range. They fire. Panthers burn. By the time the fog lifts around noon, the 113th Panzer Brigade has already lost a devastating number of tanks, and now, with the fog gone, a new weapon enters the fight. I need to tell you about Charles Carpenter. Major Charles Carpenter of Moline, Illinois. His official job was observation pilot. He flew a Piper L-4 Grasshopper, a tiny fabric-covered 2-seat airplane designed for spotting enemy positions and directing artillery fire. Think of it as the 1944 equivalent of a drone. Small, slow, completely unarmed, except Carpenter's was not unarmed, because Charlie Carpenter was, by all accounts, certifiably creative in his approach to warfare. Frustrated by watching German tanks escape before attack aircraft could respond, he had strapped 6 bazooka tubes to the wing struts of his little Piper Cub, 3 on each side. He named the plane Rosie the Rocketer. His fellow pilots thought he was insane. Most who tried to imitate him quickly stopped, finding that flying a fabric airplane through German ground fire was, as one report noted dryly, extremely unhealthy. Carpenter did not care. He told a Stars and Stripes correspondent, "Some people around here think I'm nuts, but I just believe that if we're going to fight a war, we have to get on with it 60 minutes an hour and 24 hours a day." On September 19th, as the fog begins to lift, Carpenter takes to the air. He spots a company of German Panthers advancing toward Aracourt. What happens next belongs in a movie. Carpenter rolls his little Piper Cub into a dive. He corkscrews down through German ground fire, rifle bullets, machine gun tracers, the works, and fires his bazookas into the top armor of the Panther column. The top armor, the one place even a Panther is thin, barely 16 to 17 millimeters on the engine deck. He hits. One Panther catches fire. He makes another pass. Another vehicle is disabled. Then he runs out of rockets. So he flies back to base, reloads, and does it again and again. In total, Carpenter fires at least 16 bazooka rockets at the German column that day. He is credited with knocking out 2 Panthers and several armored vehicles. But here is the most important thing Bazooka Charlie accomplished that day. The remaining Panthers in the formation retreated, not because of the damage, though that was real, but because they had no idea how to deal with an enemy attacking from above with rockets, from the flanks with HVAP rounds, from prepared positions with artillery, and from hull-down Shermans at close range. This is what combined arms warfare looks like. It is not about one weapon being better than another. It is about drowning the enemy in problems faster than he can solve them. By evening on September 19th, the 113th Panzer Brigade has been mauled. Colonel von Zeckendorf's force has lost dozens of tanks. The Americans have lost far fewer, but the Germans are not done. They still have the 111th Panzer Brigade, which has finally arrived, and elements of the 11th Panzer Division. Over the next 3 days, the fighting intensifies. On September 20th, the 111th Panzer Brigade launches its attack. But again, coordination fails. The 2 German brigades cannot synchronize their movements. The 111th attacks from the south, while the 113th is licking its wounds in the east. American forces, operating on interior lines, can shift reinforcements to meet each threat. The morning of September 20th brings another devastating blow to the Germans. They push a column of armor toward the CCA command post area. Abrams calls for Captain Jimmy Leach, 22 years old, commanding Baker Company, to bring his tanks from Chambray. Leach arrives at Clark's command post to find an exasperated colonel. "Where the hell is your company?" Clark demands. Leach had come ahead of his tanks, thinking it was a routine meeting. His company is minutes behind him. When they arrive, Leach and his Shermans drive straight into the German flank. What follows is one of the most audacious tank actions of the war. Leach's Baker Company and elements of Able Company form a makeshift task force under Major William Hunter. They spot an assembly area containing 15 to 20 Panthers. Rather than engage from a distance, where the Panthers' superior guns would dominate, Hunter's task force charges. Baker Company sweeps around the German flank and drives straight through the Panzer assembly area, guns blazing, then wheels around and drives back through it again. Panthers are burning on all sides. The German crews, many of whom have never experienced anything like this, are in chaos. Miraculously, Baker Company emerges from this charge without losing a single tank. Able Company commander Captain Spencer is less lucky. He loses 3 Shermans, including his own. But Spencer survives, finds 8 of his crewmen on foot, and walks them back to the battalion area. Think about the sheer aggression of that maneuver. Shermans driving through a concentration of Panthers. 3 months earlier, in the hedgerows of Normandy, that would have been unthinkable. But these are not the same crews who landed on Utah Beach. These men have been fighting continuously since July. They know their terrain, they trust their leaders, and they have just enough HVAP ammunition to make a frontal engagement survivable. But not every engagement went the Americans' way. And this is important, because if I told you it was all triumph and glory, you would stop trusting me. After returning from their successful counterattack, Abrams sent a task force north of the Paroy Forest to clear the area of remaining German forces. When Charlie Company, 37th Tank Battalion, crested a rise near the town of Leh, they drove straight into a German ambush. Panthers and 75mm Pak-40 anti-tank guns were waiting for them, hull down and camouflaged. The first German volleys destroyed 6 Shermans in rapid succession. 6 tanks, gone in seconds. The ambush was textbook, concealed positions, interlocking fields of fire, and no warning. In return, the American tanks that survived the initial volley knocked out 7 German tanks and 3 anti-tank guns. But the cost was brutal. This is the reality of armored warfare. You can have the best ammunition in the world. You can have the best training. But if you drive over a ridge into a prepared ambush, you are going to take casualties. The Panther, sitting hull down in a defensive position, with only its well-armored turret exposed, was still one of the most dangerous weapons on any battlefield. By day's end on September 22nd, the Germans had lost 16 more tanks, 257 killed and 80 captured. The 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades combined had only 54 operational tanks left from the 180 they started with. The 2 brigades had lost nearly 70% of their armor in 4 days. On September 21st, the battle takes its heaviest toll on the Germans. Colonel von Zeckendorf, commander of the 113th Panzer Brigade, is killed in action. His brigade is disintegrating. A makeshift battle group is formed from the remnants, but it is no longer a coherent fighting force. By September 22nd, the major German offensive efforts have stalled. What follows over the next week is a series of smaller actions, probes, counterattacks, skirmishes, as the 5th Panzer Army tries desperately to salvage something from the debacle. They cannot. By September 29th, the 113th Panzer Brigade can muster fewer than 20 operational vehicles from the 90 it started with. The 111th Panzer Brigade is in even worse shape. By one account, only 7 tanks and 80 men are operational by the end of the heaviest fighting. The final toll of the 4-day tank battle from September 19th to 22nd, CCA lost 14 medium Shermans and 7 light tanks, with 25 killed and 88 wounded. The Germans lost 2 Panzer Brigades as effective fighting formations. American claims for the broader battle period ranged from 86 to over 200 German armored vehicles destroyed, depending on the source and time period covered. The most staggering number came from the 111th Panzer Brigade. By the evening of September 22nd, one of the units that had started with approximately 90 tanks could put only 7 operational tanks and 80 men into the field. 7 from 90. The brigade had been functionally annihilated in 4 days of fighting. Manteuffel's urgent pleas to the Luftwaffe for air support had gone unanswered. The skies, when the fog cleared, belonged to American P-47 Thunderbolts from the 19th Tactical Air Command, swooping down on German columns caught on narrow roads. For the entire Lorraine campaign, the 4th Armored Division claimed 281 German tanks destroyed, 3,000 German soldiers killed, and 3,000 taken prisoner. Britannica records that at Aracourt, the 37th Tank Battalion alone lost 14 Shermans, while knocking out 55 Panthers and Tigers. Think about those numbers. 55 to 14, nearly 4 to 1 in favor of the Americans, against Panthers, in Shermans. That was not supposed to happen. Not according to the technical specifications. Not according to the German war planners who sent the Panzer Brigades to Aracourt expecting a quick, decisive victory. But wars are not fought on paper. They are fought by men like Abrams and Lamison and Leach and Dwight and Carpenter, men who had learned that the Panther's myth of invincibility had a crack in it, a literal crack, right through the gun mantlet, and they had 6 rounds that could exploit it. The Battle of Aracourt sent shockwaves through the German command. After-action reports from the 5th Panzer Army struggled to explain what had happened. How had inexperienced crews in newly produced Panthers been defeated so comprehensively? The answers, as the German staff officers pieced together the disaster, were layered. The first was tactical. The Panzer Brigades had been designed on paper as powerful striking forces, but they were missing the supporting elements that made a real panzer division lethal. No proper reconnaissance battalions to scout ahead, insufficient artillery to suppress American positions, no integrated infantry to clear ambush points. They were hammers without handles, swords without hilts, raw, uncoordinated striking power that shattered the moment it met organized resistance. The second was training. The crews in those factory-new Panthers had received weeks of instruction. Some had barely learned to drive their tanks before being shipped to the front. American tankers in the 4th Armored Division, by contrast, were combat veterans. They had been fighting since the Normandy breakout in July. They understood combined arms warfare intuitively. They knew how to read terrain, how to use fog and folds in the ground for concealment, how to coordinate with artillery and air support in real time. But it was the third discovery that truly alarmed the German command. German intelligence officers began examining destroyed Panthers and found something puzzling. Entry holes that were smaller than expected, sub-caliber. They recovered unexploded rounds near disabled tanks and discovered the truth: tungsten carbide cores. This was worse news than any of the tactical theories German officers had floated, that the Americans had secretly deployed 90mm guns, or that British Firefly tanks with 17-pounder guns had been loaned to American units. Those would have been problems with known solutions, but tungsten core ammunition demonstrated something far more ominous. It meant that American industrial capacity could identify a tactical problem, develop a technological solution, and begin fielding it in combat, all within months. Germany had pioneered sub-caliber ammunition with the Panzergranate 40 series, but German tungsten supplies were critically limited. Swedish imports had dried up. Domestic production was negligible. By late 1944, what little tungsten Germany had was being hoarded for machine tools needed to build aircraft engines. Panther crews received only standard ammunition. Here is one of the great ironies of the war. Germany invented sub-caliber tungsten core ammunition before America did. They were first. Their Panzergranate 40 was an elegant design. But knowing how to build something and being able to build enough of it are two entirely different problems. Germany had the science. America had the supply chain, and in a war of industrial attrition, the supply chain wins every time. The French, by the way, tried using captured Panthers after the war. They abandoned the attempt. The tanks were, in the words of French assessors, utterly unusable, without the German maintenance infrastructure to support them. The Panther was a magnificent fighting machine. It was also a mechanical prima donna that broke down constantly and required specialized technical support that only existed in Germany. After the war, the French found that Panthers needed major engine overhauls every 1,000 kilometers. The Sherman just kept running. The Americans, despite their own tungsten scarcity, were still producing more HVAP than Germany could dream of. Not enough, never enough, but more. And that gap between the American ability to respond to problems and the German inability to do the same was the gap that would decide the war. But here is where I have to be honest with you. Because HVAP was not a miracle, it had limits, serious limits. And those limits were about to be tested in the worst possible conditions. December was coming. The Ardennes were waiting. And the 6 rounds that had worked so well at Aracourt were about to run out at the worst possible moment. Part 4. The cruel math. The bulge and the breaking point. Before we enter the frozen hell of the Ardennes, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you had just enough of something, just barely enough, and then someone took half of it away? That is what happened to HVAP ammunition in December 1944. Remember the production numbers? By November, the factories were turning out 5,000 rounds per month. By January, 7,000. These sound like big numbers until you realize how many guns needed them. Every 76mm Sherman in Europe, every M18 Hellcat tank destroyer, every M10 and M36 with a compatible gun. We are talking about thousands of vehicles across an entire theater of war. The allocation system was a nightmare. Decisions about who got HVAP were made at every level, from Army headquarters down to individual battalion supply officers. Some units received more than they could immediately use, Others exhausted their supply in a single engagement and sent urgent requests for resupply that went unanswered for days or weeks. Tank destroyers got priority. Their entire purpose was killing enemy armor, so they got first pick of the HVAP supply. Shermans, with their dual role of infantry support and tank fighting, were second in line, which makes sense on an organizational chart. But in the real world, it was Shermans that encountered Panthers most often, not tank destroyers. Picture a battalion supply officer in late November 1944. He gets a shipment of HVAP rounds, let us say 200. He has 5 tank companies to supply. That is 40 rounds per company, 17 tanks per company. So each tank gets, if he is generous, 2 HVAP rounds. 2, down from the 6 they had at Aracourt. That is 2 chances to kill a Panther before you are back to ammunition that the Panther laughs at. Now fast forward to December 16th, 1944. The German surprise offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler had assembled a massive force in secrecy, 25 divisions, including some of the best panzer formations Germany still possessed. Hundreds of Panthers and Tigers rolled through the Ardennes forests toward thinly held American lines. The weather was terrible. Snow, fog, freezing cold, which grounded Allied air power. The one weapon that had proven most effective against German armor concentrations, P-47 Thunderbolts dropping bombs and firing rockets, could not fly. American units in the path of the offensive were thrown into chaos. Some were overrun in hours. Others fought desperate holding actions that became legendary. And everywhere, tank crews were reaching for their precious HVAP rounds. Here is the brutal arithmetic. A Sherman company engaged in heavy fighting might use all its HVAP in a single day of combat. Resupply was nearly impossible. German advances had cut supply lines. Roads were blocked by snow, wrecked vehicles, and in some cases, German units. Ammunition trucks that could get through carried a mix of supplies, and HVAP was not always top priority when units also needed fuel, food, and standard ammunition. Some tank crews exhausted their HVAP completely within the first 3 days of the Bulge. When the next Panther appeared in their gun sight, they were back to the standard M62 round, back to bouncing shells off sloped armor, back to the terror of Normandy. But here is what I want you to understand. The crews did not stop fighting. They adapted. What happened next in the Ardennes was a masterclass in American improvisation. Crews who had spent months learning to rely on HVAP suddenly found themselves fighting with the old tools and had to reinvent their tactics on the fly. In the frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, innovation happened not in testing laboratories, but in the field, under fire, by men who had no choice but to figure it out or die. Tank crews coordinated more closely with infantry than they ever had before. Bazooka teams would work alongside Shermans, creeping through the snow to get close enough to a Panther to hit it in the side or rear with a rocket. The Sherman would provide covering fire, suppressing the Panther's infantry support, while the bazooka team moved into position. Artillery forward observers called in time-on-target missions, dozens of howitzer shells arriving simultaneously on a single point. These shells could not penetrate Panther armor, but they could damage optics, blow off external equipment, cut radio antennas, destroy tracks, and kill exposed crew members. A Panther with no optics is effectively blind. A Panther with no tracks is a very expensive pillbox. And when the weather finally broke in late December, when the fog lifted and the clouds parted, the P-47s came screaming down on German armored columns caught on narrow forest roads. Rockets, bombs, and .50 caliber machine gun fire turned those roads into scrapyards. Let me tell you about what Abrams did during the Bulge, because it may be the most dramatic chapter of his war. By December 1944, Abrams was commanding Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division. Patton had been given orders to turn his entire 3rd Army 90 degrees, from facing east toward Germany to facing north toward the Bulge. It was one of the most audacious operational maneuvers of the war. shifting a full army across icy roads in the middle of winter, then immediately attacking. Patton told the 4th Armored to drive like hell toward Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded by German forces. For 5 brutal days, Abrams and his tankers pushed north through snow, fog, minefields, and the German 5th Fallschirmjäger Division. He was down to 20 operational tanks. 20 tanks to break through a ring of German steel around Bastogne. On the afternoon of December 26th, Abrams stood on a hill 5 miles south of Bastogne. He could see C-47 transports dropping supplies to the besieged paratroopers. He made a decision. He climbed into Thunderbolt 4, by now his 4th Sherman of that name, stuck a cigar in his mouth, and radioed his men. His words, recorded by those present, "We're going into those people now. Let her roll." Supporting artillery pounded the village of Eisenhower, just south of Bastogne. Abrams's column crashed through. Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding the lead tanks, blasted through Eisenhower toward the 101st Airborne's perimeter. At 4:50 in the afternoon, Bogus jumped from his tank when a grinning airborne engineer emerged from a foxhole. The siege was broken. A Yank magazine correspondent recorded the scene. As dusk started to come down, Colonel Abrams rode through, a short, stocky man with sharp features, already a legendary figure in this war. That same week, Captain Jimmy Leach, remember him from Aracourt, 22 years old, Baker Company, led his tanks in an assault on the town of Bigonville, Luxembourg, on December 24th, Christmas Eve. 2 of his tanks were destroyed early in the attack. He took a painful head wound. He kept fighting. Later, he was wounded again. He still did not stop. Leach's ferocious leadership at Bigonville earned him the Distinguished Service Cross, the 2nd highest valor award in the U.S. Army. The next night, with his head, cheek, and calf bandaged, he led his company 30 miles east to rejoin the battalion's push toward Bastogne. Abrams's description of young Captain Leach, written in his evaluation report that December, says everything. The placid, modest, friendly exterior of this officer disguises the fighting heart of a lion and the tenaciousness of a bulldog, all seasoned with an engaging personality. Leach would earn 5 Purple Hearts before the war ended, 5 separate wounds. He would go on to command the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment in Vietnam, retire as a colonel, and spend the rest of his life returning to Lorraine and Luxembourg, visiting the towns his company had liberated, celebrating with citizens who remembered. But let me bring this back to the ammunition. Because the Battle of the Bulge proved 2 things simultaneously. First, HVAP worked. In every engagement where American crews had HVAP rounds available and used them correctly, at the right range, against the right targets. They achieved kills against Panthers and even Tigers that would have been impossible with standard ammunition. The rounds did what the engineers had designed them to do. Second, there was never, ever enough. The scarcity of HVAP during the Bulge, when it was needed most desperately, haunted American armored officers for the rest of the war and well beyond. When the Bulge ended in late January 1945, the German armored force was shattered. Hundreds of Panthers and Tigers had been lost, not just to HVAP, not just to air power, but to the cumulative grinding of combined arms warfare, fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and the relentless advance of American and British forces. By early 1945, German armored units were abandoning their tanks, not because of combat damage, because they had no fuel to run them. Panther production, which had peaked at around 380 per month in the summer of 1944, was collapsing under Allied strategic bombing. German factories were being overrun. Raw materials were exhausted. Tungsten, which Germany needed for machine tools to build everything else, was gone. The technical limitations of HVAP deserve honest examination. The tungsten carbide core was hard, but it was also brittle. At longer ranges, where the round had lost velocity, the core could shatter on impact instead of penetrating. Below about 2,300 to 2,500 feet per second, the probability of shattering increased significantly. This meant that at ranges beyond roughly 1,000 meters against a Panther's mantlet, HVAP became unreliable. American crews learned this the hard way. Some, in the heat of battle, fired HVAP at Panthers from too far away. The rounds shattered. The precious tungsten was wasted, and the Panther, now alerted to the Sherman's position, returned fire with a gun that was still effective at that range. Training on HVAP employment was often minimal. The ammunition arrived at the front faster than instruction manuals could be written. Many crews figured out proper engagement techniques through trial and error, the most expensive form of education when the tuition is paid in blood. One documented experience illustrates both the promise and the frustration. In November 1944, a Sherman crew engaged a Panther at approximately 800 yards. The gunner fired multiple rounds, observing hits on the Panther's side armor. To his frustration, the rounds ricocheted without achieving full penetration. The angle of impact was too oblique. The side armor, though thinner than the front, was still resistant when hit at a shallow angle. The Panther withdrew rather than continuing the engagement, so the action was not a total failure. But it reminded everyone that HVAP was not a magic bullet. Proper shot placement, correct range estimation, and favorable impact angles still mattered. HVAP gave crews a better tool. It did not make them into superheroes. Against the Panther's glacis plate that sloped frontal armor, HVAP remained largely ineffective at most combat ranges. The extreme angle caused rounds to ricochet or shatter regardless of velocity. Sherman crews still needed to maneuver for flank shots or target the mantlet. HVAP gave them a better tool, not a magic wand. But here is what mattered most. HVAP changed the way American tankers thought about themselves. Before HVAP, encountering a Panther was a crisis. After HVAP, it was a problem. A serious problem, but one that could be solved by skilled crews using the right ammunition at the right range. A crew that believes it can fight will engage aggressively. A crew that believes it is doomed will hesitate, retreat, or call for someone else to deal with the threat. That psychological shift, from helplessness to confidence, is worth more than any number of technical specifications. Otto Carius understood this better than most. Carius was one of Germany's most decorated tank aces. He commanded Tiger tanks on the Eastern Front and is credited with destroying more than 150 enemy vehicles. He survived the war, opened a pharmacy in the town of Hirschweiler-Pettersheim, and ran it until 2011. He died in 2015 at the age of 92. In his memoir, Tigers in the Mud, published in 1960, Carius wrote extensively about the psychological impact of facing enemies who could penetrate his armor. The sense of invulnerability that thick armor provided was crucial to crew morale and aggressive tactics. When a Tiger crew knew that enemy shells would bounce harmlessly off the hull, they fought boldly. They advanced. They took risks. When that certainty eroded, when a round punched through and friends died, something changed. Crews became cautious, hesitant. They waited longer before engaging. They took fewer risks. Panther crews facing HVAP-equipped Shermans experienced exactly this erosion of confidence. The mantlet, which had always been a vulnerable point, became a known death trap. Word spread through panzer units. The Americans have new ammunition. It can come through the front. You are not safe anymore. By the German reports from late September 1944, Panther crews were demonstrably more cautious, slower to advance, more reliant on defensive positions. And defensive warfare ceded the initiative to the Americans. Exactly the people you did not want to have the initiative, because they would bring artillery, air power, and flanking forces to bear on your position. The Panther did not stop being a dangerous opponent. Far from it. In defensive positions, hull down behind a ridge with only the turret exposed, a Panther in the hands of an experienced crew remained one of the deadliest weapons on any battlefield. But the myth, the belief that a Panther facing an American Sherman was playing with a guaranteed advantage, that myth died at Aracourt, and that shift was about to be proven beyond any doubt, thousands of miles away, in a war most people have forgotten. Part 5 plus verdict. Vindication and the Final Ledger. June 25, 1950. North Korean forces pour across the 38th parallel. The Korean War begins, and American tankers are about to learn what Aracourt might have looked like if they had been given enough ammunition. The irony was almost cruel. 5 years after the greatest war in human history had ended, American tankers were climbing back into Shermans. Not because the Sherman was the best tank available, the M26 Pershing and the M46 Patton existed, but the Sherman was there. It was available. It was reliable. And for Korea, it would have to do. The United States sent Sherman tanks to Korea, specifically the M4A3E8, the Easy 8 variant with the 76mm gun and improved suspension, essentially the same tank that had fought at Aracourt and in the Bulge, the same gun, the same ammunition types. Some of those Shermans had probably rolled off the same assembly lines that built the tanks Abrams drove through France. But one thing was different. Tungsten was no longer scarce. But one thing was different. Tungsten was no longer scarce. The war had been over for 5 years. Chinese tungsten was flowing freely. American domestic production had increased. There were no competing demands from 100 different war industries. The stockpiles that had been so desperately rationed in 1944 were now full. American Shermans in Korea carried plentiful HVAP ammunition, not 6 rounds, not 5, full racks. Their opponents, Soviet-built T-34/85 tanks in North Korean and later Chinese service. The T-34/85 was a formidable machine, the tank that had broken the back of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, but its armor was significantly thinner than the Panthers. 90mm on the turret front, 45mm on the glacis. HVAP rounds went through a T-34/85 like a fist through wet paper. American Shermans in Korea achieved remarkably favorable exchange ratios against communist armor, not just because of better training, not just because of combined arms coordination, but because, for the first time, Sherman crews had enough of the right ammunition to fight without counting every round. The vindication was bittersweet. Veterans of the European theater, the men who had fought at Aracourt and the Bulge with 5 or 6 HVAP rounds and prayed they would not need a 7th, watched the news from Korea and thought, if we had had this in 1944, how many friends would still be alive? That is a question nobody can answer, but it is a question that shaped American military thinking for the next 80 years. Let me bring this story full circle. Creighton Abrams survived the war. All 7 Thunderbolts, the Normandy breakout, Aracourt, the Bulge, the dash to the Rhine. He commanded the first unit to reach the Rhine River in Patton's Third Army. After the war, he commanded troops in the Korean War, led the 3rd Armored Division in Germany during the Berlin Wall crisis, oversaw federal troops during the civil rights struggles of the early 1960s, and eventually took command of American forces in Vietnam. He rose to become Chief of Staff of the United States Army, the top uniformed officer in the service. In 1980, 6 years after Abrams's death from cancer at age 59, 11 days short of his 60th birthday, the Army named its new main battle tank after him, the M1 Abrams. A heavy cigar smoker his entire life, Abrams died at Walter Reed Army Medical Center from complications of surgery to remove a cancerous lung. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His wife, Julie, who had founded the Army's group of Arlington ladies and devoted her life to humanitarian causes, survived him by nearly 30 years. Their legacy was extraordinary. All 3 of the Abrams sons became Army general officers. The family name became synonymous with armored excellence across 3 generations. And here is the detail that closes the loop. The M1, Abrams was deliberately designed with the lessons of 1944 burned into its DNA. A powerful 120mm smoothbore gun, sophisticated ammunition, including depleted uranium penetrators, dense, hard kinetic energy projectiles that serve exactly the same function as those tungsten carbide HVAP rounds did 40 years earlier. Concentrate maximum energy into the smallest, densest possible projectile at the highest achievable velocity. From the M93 HVAP at Aracourt to the modern armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot rounds fired by today's Abrams tanks, the principle has not changed. only the materials and the precision. Captain Jimmy Leach, the young lion of Baker Company, survived the war with 5 Purple Hearts and a Distinguished Service Cross. He went on to command the 11th Armored Cavalry in Vietnam. After retiring as a colonel, he dedicated decades to ensuring the history of the 37th Tank Battalion was not forgotten. He became the honorary colonel of the 37th Armor Regiment and inspired the creation of the 37th Armor Alumni Association, which today numbers 5,000 members. He returned to France repeatedly over the decades, visiting Haraucourt and Bastogne, celebrating with the French and Luxembourg citizens his unit had liberated. In September 2009, at the age of 87, Leach made his final visit to Lorraine for the 65th anniversary of the battle. 3 months later, he passed away. Bazooka Charlie Carpenter, the man who dove a fabric airplane through gunfire to attack Panthers with bazookas, was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease shortly after Haraucourt. He was told he had about 2 years to live. He lived for more than 20. He spent those years teaching and writing, the same gentle philosopher with a poetic bent, who had once said his idea of fighting a war was to attack, and then attack again. He died in 1966. Colonel von Zeckendorf, who led the 113th Panzer Brigade into the fog at Haraucourt, was killed on September 21, 1944. His brigade was disbanded on October 1st. Its shattered remnants were absorbed by the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. By that point, there was barely enough left to fill a company. And the 37th Tank Battalion, the unit that Abrams built, that Lamazon and Leach and Gutowski and Dwight fought in, after Haraucourt and Bastogne, they crossed the Rhine, drove deep into Germany, and in April 1945, the 37th Tank Battalion was among the units that liberated Dachau concentration camp. The men who had fought Panthers and Tigers in the fog of Lorraine came face to face with the worst horror the human race had produced. Many veterans would later say that Dachau haunted them more than any battle. The battalion exists today, redesignated as the 37th Armor Regiment, based at Fort Bliss, Texas, part of the 1st Armored Division. Its soldiers still serve under the motto, "Courage Conquers." The standards Abrams set in 1944 are still called Abrams Standards in the unit. Now, the verdict. If you look at the Battle of Haraucourt strictly through the lens of ammunition, did HVAP win the battle? The answer is nuanced. HVAP contributed. It was a factor. But the comprehensive post-war analysis concluded that the truly decisive elements were superior tactics, better training, combined arms coordination, overwhelming artillery support, and eventually air superiority. The Americans won at Haraucourt because they fought as a system. The Germans lost because they fought as a collection of individual tanks. But that is the view from 30,000 feet. Come down to ground level. Stand inside a Sherman turret on September 19th, 1944. Peer through the fog at the Panther emerging from the mist. And ask yourself, without those 6 tungsten core rounds in the ammunition rack, would Kenneth Lamazon's gunner have fired with confidence? Or would he have fired in despair, knowing his shell would bounce, knowing the next 5 seconds of his life might be his last? HVAP did not make the Sherman equal to the Panther. It never could. The Panther was a more powerful, better armed, more heavily armored tank by any technical measure. But HVAP gave American crews something no technical specification can quantify. It gave them a chance. And in war, a chance is all a brave man needs. The German generals who sent their panzer brigades to Haraucourt expected a quick victory. Panthers versus Shermans. The outcome should have been obvious. What they never expected, what they could not have anticipated, was that 6 rounds of tungsten, born in Chinese mines and American factories, carried across the Atlantic and distributed 6 per tank, would fundamentally alter the psychology of armored warfare. Panthers were no longer invincible. Shermans were no longer helpless, and the men inside those Shermans, men like Abrams, sitting in the turret of Thunderbolt with a cigar clenched between his teeth, they stopped being afraid. Patton called Abrams his peer, the world champion. After the war, Abrams gave all the credit to his soldiers. "I have traveled in gallant company," he wrote to his wife Julie. That is the final lesson of Aracourt. Technology matters. Production matters. Tungsten and muzzle velocity and penetration tables, they all matter. But what matters most is the crew that believes it has a fighting chance and decides to take it. 6 rounds. That was all they had, and it was enough. If this deep dive into the untold story of HVAP ammunition gave you something you did not know before, hit that subscribe button. It tells the algorithm this kind of research-driven history is worth watching. And it is free, unlike an M93 round, which cost the United States government approximately 5 kilograms of the rarest metal on the planet. I will see you in the next one. And remember, wars are not won by the best weapons. They are won by the best trained crews who use the right weapon, at the right time, at the right range. Courage conquers.